Hello, I'm Ads, and today I'll be running through how I painted the biggest orc there is, Ghazghkull Thraka. Oh, and Makari as well, I suppose. This is going to be a big, slightly disjointed video, so brace yourselves. I'll try my best to walk you through what I did. This project is a little bit out of nowhere for me, but back when Ghaz's updated model came out, I instantly thought of a buddy of mine who got me started on the hobby back in school. It felt like a great opportunity to pay tribute to them for getting me started on this whole thing, so Hopper, here's to you, mate. I built Ghaz in sub-assemblies to help me out while painting, keeping his arms and head separate from the body. As a note, if I were to do another one of these, I'd probably keep the backpack off too, just trust me on that. And I primed everything but his head in Mechanicus standard grey spray. I did the head in Wraithbone instead. I'd maybe recommend a black spray instead of the grey, for reasons I'll touch on later, but in short it'll just be easier when you break out the brush. A lot of learning went on very early on in this project. I start by hitting everything that'll be harder to reach later on, so specifically all of the flesh. I severely overcomplicated things on this one because I'm tryharding, and I'm following a few step-by-step tutorials that fit well, so hopefully this isn't an off-putting video to follow. I want a paler, more I've been decapitated and stuck back on with hopes and prayers look to the head, a more lively tone for the body's skin, and a different look for the grot flesh entirely. So with all that said, I started with MK Paint 4's Orc Skin tutorial, I'll put a link below, by blocking in the more lively showing skin on Ghaz's body with Elysian green. I then thinned Cabalite green down super thinly to a wash, and introduced that to all the recesses. Being this thin means I can pull it like a glaze to where I want the colour to be the strongest and have it gradient across the surface. I do this a couple times until I'm happy with how strong the colour is, glazing back in Elysian green if I need to. I then repeat the process, only using Caliban green instead and on a smaller area than before to really get some depth on that skin. I'll then highlight up where I can, first with a 50-50 mix of Elysian green and Ogren camo, then a 50-50 mix of Ogren camo and Flayed One flesh, and when necessary a last highlight of pure Flayed One flesh. Now for Ghaz's head. I'm hoping that I can retell this right because I painted this quite a while ago at the time of recording the voiceover, and I was very smart and didn't write down the recipe. But I'm fairly sure I started with an all-over base coat of Skarsnik green first, to start off that paler, deader skin tone. I then came in with Warboss green, well thinned, and started glazing into the recesses to add some depth. Then Warflesh, covering less area this time, and finally emphasized the deepest areas of the skin with Incubi darkness. Now we go the other way and highlight up using a 50-50 mix of Skarsnik green and Flayed One flesh. Like with my shading, I'm keeping my paint pretty thin to try and keep my layers soft, glazing around the flatter areas of muscle where I need to. The last point highlight is done by adding another drop of Flayed One flesh into the previous mix. This is a bit imprecise to try and relate to y'all, but I was pretty much winging it on this one. I'm trying my best. To bring a bit of life to this dead head, I bring in Druky Violet to put a little red tone around his good eye and under his cheekbones. I then bring in some usual skin tones, first by glazing Bugman's Glow onto the lower lip, the nose and the tips of the ears. I did a choice highlight around these areas with Cadian Flesh Tone, particularly doing a dotted pattern around the lower lip to simulate some texture. Lastly, a smaller highlight with Kislev Flesh just to put the last pop onto that skin. Of course, this being the head, Ghaz also has a mouth with which to yell at you with, so I very carefully based the tongue and gums in with Screamer Pink and washed back with Druky Violet. While letting the wash dry, I then realised he's got this huge operation scar around his head that could use a little bit of work, so I brought back the Bugman's Glow and made a kind of wash with it, running it into the recess around the stitches before basing the stitches in with Rakarth flesh. With the wash dry, I then highlighted the gums and tongue, first with pink horror, and then with Kislev flesh. Again, try and be careful, it's very easy to butt your brush up against the teeth and have the bristles go haywire at this point. After I lie down from the stress of painting in the mouth, I then base the teeth in with Rakarth flesh, taking care around the gum line. Take note that I think the big tooth on the right is meant to be metal. I didn't realise this until I based everything in and spotted the rivet. The teeth then get a generous wash with Agrax Earthshade. I did 2 washes here to get some grimy looking teeth, one all over and then one further back towards the gum line to darken them down near the base. When dry, they then got a highlight with Pallid Witch flesh, painting in lines down the centre and each side of each tooth where I could. While both these colours were fresh on the palette, I also washed and highlighted the stitches around the head in the same way. Now for something pretty tricky, Ghaz's good eye. Eyes are difficult, and something I'm not super practiced with, having mostly done Necrons since coming back to painting, so I tried my best here. I used my comfiest brush, my size 2 Rosemary & Co is my workhorse and I know it back to front. Loaded it up with Corn Red, twisted the bristles to a point, and steadied myself as best as I could, then just touched the eyeball with the tip of the brush. I found bringing the brush in from the side of the head instead of front on is really helpful with this. As is doing this without a camera in your face, but I did my best. When the whole eye was red, I then did the same with Evils and Scarlet for the pupil. On reflection, Wild Rider Red might have been a better move, as it would have been more stark, but I'll take what I can get. Okay, last few details on the head now. I based all the silver sections of the metal plate with Iron Warriors first, then washed it back with Nuln Oil. I wanted a really dark silver on this. These areas then got a couple highlights, first with Ironbreaker, then an extreme top highlight with Stormhose Silver. I put a few scratches around the high traffic areas to simulate some wear and tear, just taking most of the paint off the brush and randomly adding lines where I think looks best is all I did. As a last bit of weathering, I heavily watered down some Scrag Brown and added it to the recesses and recessed plates to look like Ghaz is starting to rust up a little bit. I then based the pitted plate on the temple with Balthazar Gold to try and break up the massive silver up there. I washed it back with Agrax Earthshade before relayering the flat of the plate with Gehenna's Gold. I mixed Gehenna's Gold 50-50 with Stormhose Silver after that to put a last highlight on the roundest part of the plate, before adding a little Nihilakh Oxide here and there to simulate some rusting. At the same time as the last part, I was doing the lens of Ghaz's other eye, so don't mind some weirdness with the editing here. It makes more sense to describe each part individually, is all. I based the whole lens in matte black first, being careful around the metal casing. Next I took Corn Red and drew a thick crescent moon shape in the lower right portion of the lens. I then do the same thing with Evil Sun Scarlet, Wild Rider Red, and Fire Dragon Bright, drawing smaller and smaller crescents each time. I finish with a small dot of white ink in the very lower right corner and a larger one in the upper left corner to mimic a shiny reflection. I love painting lenses like this, it looks super convincing. You can add a gloss varnish over this if you so wish to make it really glassy, but I left mine as is, that's your choice. The last thing on the head here is the cables, and you want to be the most careful you can be here to avoid getting paint anywhere where you don't want it. The squarer cable on the right of the group I did the same way I do my black Necron cables. I'll link a video somewhere that'll have a chapter on that. As a quick rundown though, I based the cable in Corax White first, before layering all over with Griff Charger Grey contrast, then Black Templar contrast. I then edge highlighted with Thunderhawk Blue, Fenrisian Grey, and Ulthuan Grey in smaller and smaller areas. The larger middle cable I wanted to be yellow with a hazard stripe, so I started by basing with Avalan Sunset. To save on time, I knew I wanted the last cable to be red, so I based that with Mephiston Red. Both colours can be washed back with Agrax Earthshade at the same time then. I relayered the red cable with Evil Sun Scarlet and added a glaze of Wild Rider Red to the extreme curves to finish that one off, nice and quick. The yellow cable I relayed a couple times with Aerial Yellow to build a strong colour back over the wash, before manually drawing in a highlight line with Pallid Witch Flesh. The hazard stripes are a bit more of a test of will, as getting a strong yellow like this takes a bit of time, but hopefully the way I do it can alleviate some stress. Take your black paint of choice, I use matte black here, thin it down quite a way and steady yourself. I marked out the centre line of my black marks, keeping in mind the pattern wraps around the whole cable, so try to leave enough space between the lines. Then slowly widen out each side of the centre line to a thickness you like. Let it dry, then paint over the pattern again to get a solid black colour on there. If you mess up, bring back Aerial Yellow to cut back into the black. It might take a pass or two, but it's worth it for the straight lines. I finished the stripes up by following the Pallid Witch Flesh highlight line on the yellow with Dawnstone, then a last bright highlight with Administratum Grey. For Makari's flesh I went with a 50-50 mix of Scarsnick Green and Avalanche Sunset, to get a more yellowed skin tone, just to differentiate the grot from the Orc a little bit here. I then repeated the same washing stage as the Orc body, using Warflesh instead of Cabalite Green, and Incubi Darkness instead of Caliban Green. Again, getting this as thin as I have it lets me control how strong the colour gets where I want it. To highlight up I used the same mix as the base to bring back the mid-tone, then another highlight with 1 part Screaming Skull added to the base mix. I used dots of Screaming Skull to finish off the top highlight on the skin, before using the same glazing technique as I did on Ghaz's head to add some Kislev flesh around the nose and ears. So from this point on, Ghaz and Makari will share a majority of the colours, but I'll just be showing it on Ghaz for ease of filming. Pants will be the same colour, black sections will be the same, etc, etc. I next based in the pants as they're the next thing up that I can reach. I carefully based them in with Baneblade Brown, watching as best as I could for the patches of skin showing through them. These were then washed down with Agrax Earthshade. Okay, now for a test of my patience. I based all of the black armour plates on the body with matte black. This is why I say that priming with black might be a better idea, as my god was this a chore. Not only picking out the right plates, but having to do them twice to get decent coverage. Matte black also proved to not be as matte as I'd like it, as I started to struggle to see what I was painting onto from this point because of the sheen under my light. I've tried Doom Death Black from Two Thin Coats since filming this, and it's delightful, probably be using that as my main black now. I then brought in very watered down Rhinox hide to use as a sort of wash for the black armour. You can't really darken down black anymore with washes, so a rusty red brown colour like this can add a bit of depth and early weathering to black panels like this. I then used Dark Reaper to start highlighting all this black. I started with a very thin paint and glazed up ridges to the cold blue highlights I want on there, bringing back matte black where I needed to even out transitions. I then edge highlighted all of black, taking my time and making sure I hit everywhere. I also thinned the paint down more and draw in random scuffs and scratches to show some wear and tear. In all honesty, I should have done this step before the Rhinox hide wash, but hey ho, I come back off camera and reintroduce the colour back where it's needed. The sharper edges get a brighter highlight of Thunderhawk blue, as well as repeating the scuffing step more sparingly, and the sharpest corners and edges get a last dot of Fenrisian grey. At this point I noticed the pants looked very plain, so I decided to do those next. I did another all over wash of Agrax Earthshade to further darken down the colour. The first wash didn't seem to do a lot to it. I then brought back Baneblade Brown and relayered the pants on the areas that would catch light, before using Karak Stone as a second smaller relayer to highlight. I'd wanted to add a patchworky texture to these, but it proved too difficult to get the brush under the wires, so I just went with thin glazes instead. Now for something else that took a long time, basing in the metallic details. I start with the silver stuff by basing these details in lead belcher. The box art shows two different tones of silver on Ghaz, so I'll tint some of these down in a sec. To keep that orky ramshackle look they're famous for, I used some other metallic colours to base in a few other details here and there, namely Balthazar Gold and Runelord Brass. Switch back and forth between these and your silvers to layer up a bunch of different metal surfaces. You can hit whatever panels you want like this. The idea is to make it look like the suit's been patched up with whatever metal's been found on a battlefield by a mech. You could even paint in some of the colours of your rival's Space Marine chapter, if that applies. With all those metals based, I used a 50-50 mix of Black Templar and Contrast Medium to stain the silver areas that are more black metal on the box art. Again, you can pick out whatever you like for this to make Ghaz look a bit more ramshackle. I did 2 coats of this to get the desired coverage. I then tried a bit of an experiment as I think it came out a bit too opaque for my liking. I took the same mix of medium and Black Templar and added an extra part of lead belcher, dry brushing this mix over the black metal areas just to bring back a bit of that metallic sheen. I think you could probably achieve the same effect with Iron Warriors, but I had enough of the mix left over so I just tried it out. I then did the same but lighter with straight lead belcher to highlight, and brought out the brush to touch some Ironbreaker highlights over that. With the black metal sorted, I cleaned up any areas I'd overspilled with the dry brushing. Then with that dried, I washed all the other metals with Agrax Earthshade to muck them up. They were too shiny for orcs, as was after all. Then I went about highlighting all these metallics, hopping around between drying times to try and keep my dry brush in use as much as possible. For the silver, I lightly dry brushed Ironbreaker, keeping as much of the grimy metal in the recesses as I could, followed up much more lightly with Runefang Steel. Where I needed, I glazed the highlights on, and also added light scratching to add some texture as I went. I repeated similar steps on the copper with Hashut Copper and a 50-50 mix of Hashut Copper and Canoptek Alloy. And on the brass I used Runelord Brass and Canoptek Alloy. With the warmer metals I tried stippling with the dry brush to try and vary up some of the texture, as well as edge highlighting to make the edges look nice and sharp. I found that even a light pass on the copper areas put a bit too much bright colour in the pitted texture on the exhausts, so I re-washed those with Agrax Earthshade to darken them back down again. Okay, now for a couple spots of colour. Firstly, the white panels. I start with Celestra Grey on any panels I want white, then relayer those entirely with Ulthuan Grey. These are then washed heavily with Agrax Earthshade, dabbing away any hefty pooling left by the washes from the top side of the panels. Then, using heavily watered down Ulthuan Grey, I work the gradient back in and smoothed out any tide lines, as well as edge highlighting the whole panel. I then use white ink to edge the upper facing edges and sharpest points. I thought I'd try my hand then at some freehand check patterns. The box art shows them on the Iron Goblin on the back of Gork's Claw. I can't lie, this was a tad stressful as I'd gotten a nice finish on those black areas, but I wanted to give it a try. The colours are the same as the fully white panels, so you know how they go down. The checks were first loosely drawn on with a watered down Celestra Grey, picking a halfway point and drawing a line across the whole gob. Then another line for the upper checks, before drawing in vertical lines that make roughly squares. When I was happy, I filled in the white squares with Celestra Grey, then repeated the last steps, relayed with Ulthuan Grey, washed with Agrax Earthshade, relayed with Ulthuan Grey, and the very top ones and rivets highlighted with white ink. If you make any mistakes, bring back your black and just tidy the lines up. Freehand like this is a bit of a dance between colours to keep things neat. I also cut into the pattern with the black to make it look like it had been scraped off, and highlighted the bottom of the bigger ones with white ink to make them look like flaking paint. Now to add some speed to Ghaz with some red panels. The teeth and a couple of his hanging Orky charms I based with Corn Red. When dry, I washed them twice with Agrax Earthshade. Turns out Corn Red isn't too stained by Earthshade, today I learned. I then heavily watered down my Corn Red and glazed up the panels to keep that dirty recess. I did the same then with Evil Sun Scarlet, as well as edge highlighting the panels with it. Then the same again with Wild Rider Red, and a last point highlight with Fire Dragon Bright. The red checks on the back of Gork's Claw you can go about a couple ways, but both need the same freehand checks as the gob. You can either use the reds I mentioned to freehand the checks using the same method of drawing and painting, or you can do them in white first and paint over a thin layer of red contrast paint to tint the white squares. I went with the first method here for a better colour match, but just letting you know there are other ways to do it. For the yellow panels, I based them with a couple layers of Avalanche Sunset before washing them down with Agrax Earthshade. I then repeated the glazing and edging steps I did on the red using Avalanche Sunset again, then Aerial Yellow, and a final highlight of Ushabti Bone. At this point, if you want to add more freehands, like the little triangles you see dotted around the box art, or transfers to the armour, now's the time to do it. Before I move on to the softer materials, I'm going to weather out all of the metal panels we've finished up here with a few different methods. Time to have a bit of fun. Firstly, I cut a square off of a kitchen sponge kindly donated from my kitchen drawer. I ball this up so that I've got control of the movement, then dip it in lead belcher and pat it around the metal areas that I want to chip away paint from, looking specifically at the black, yellow and red areas. I then repeated the same process with Runefang steel, trying my best to keep inside of those lead belcher patterns. Secondly, I introduced rust and oxide to the raw metals by heavily watering down a couple colours and washing it into the areas that would catch rain. For the silver I used Scrag Brown, and for the copper and brass areas I used Nylak Oxide. I added a little more Agrax Earthshade to the ends of the shiny parts of any pistons, just to add some grease buildup in there, then brought back my highlight colours to introduce a faux highlight on the lower sides of these chips. I took a quick pass around the mini at this point and painted in anything that I'd start having a hard time reaching when I move on to the softer materials, or just areas that needed finishing off. I missed a chain around one of the red hanging orc symbols for example, as well as the belt fan on the engine. Something else I'd neglected was the lamps on the inside of the jaw and on the engine. I did the one in the jaw yellow with a weak light emanating from it, starting with Avalanche Sunset on the glass, liberally washed with a couple coats of Agrax Earthshade. I then stippled thin Avalanche Sunset towards the middle of the glass, then again with Aerial Yellow, before putting a little reflected light on Ghaz's jaw nearest the lamp. Truth be told, you can't see it too well with the head in the mini. I'm missing an airbrush to make a really stark effect like I was imagining, so I ended up putting another heavy wash of Earthshade on the glass to dirty it up. The one on the back was done in the same way, but instead I went with Corn Red, one relayer of Corn Red after the washes, and a couple white highlights painted in to mimic a light that's not currently on. If it goes on, there's probably a problem after all. I stuck the head and gob on at this point, and I have to say I'm really happy with how this looks so far. But there's more to be done. The leather sections I want to be worn and well used, so I'll be following the SN Battle Reports tutorial on painting leather here. It's an excellent method, and I used it recently to paint my Mass Effect inspired Votan Karl's jacket with, and it came out fantastically. I'll link that video below, check that out for a more detailed dive on how to do it. To run through it quickly for the sake of this video though, I based the leather in a 1-to-1 mix of Rhinox hide and black, relayering with Rhinox hide after that, edge highlighting with Mornfang brown, again and scratching in with Scrag brown, and lastly with XV88. I do a tidy up with Rhinox hide, then wash the recesses with a 1-to-1 mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. For the other red areas, i.e. the tabard and the red cable casings, I base completely with Corn Red, being careful around the inside of the leg the tabard's modelled against. I washed these details back with Nuln oil this time, before highlighting them up with some different reds that I used on the metals. I went with Corn Red, Wazdaka Red and Squig Orange in this case, adding in some light scratches to scuff up the cloth. I then went around and gave some attention to the remaining stitches around the mini, painting them the same way I did the ones around Ghaz's head. Rakath flesh, washed back with Agrax Earthshade, then picked out with Pallid Witch flesh. I used the same colours and techniques to do any rags around the mini as well. There are a lot of smaller cables around Ghaz, so I mostly repeated the same steps used on his head. Some hazard stripes, some black and some red. I also did some in silver using similar steps as on the metallics, some lucky blue cables with Araman blue, and a couple cables you can't see anymore with Xerius purple. They's the sneakiest cables. The various skulls and teeth that are scattered around, I wanted a different shade of bony cream to his teeth, so I based them all in Xandri dust first. These got a wash of Agrax Earthshade before carefully relayering up with well-thinned Xandri dust again. I take care with skulls to keep definition around the brow, cheeks and top of the skull. I highlight again then with Ushabti Bone, Screaming Skull and Pallid Witch Flesh, highlighting in a smaller and smaller area but still using well-thinned paint to keep a gradient. With the tusks on the head, I'd originally wanted to paint growth lines along them, but this proved a bit out of my reach. I tried, I just couldn't keep the lines straight and looking convincing. This is a really tricky area to paint smoothly, so I found mixing my colours between stages helped with that. Mix Xandri Dust and Ushabti Bone 50-50 for the first layer, then pure Ushabti Bone for the second, Ushabti Bone and Screaming Skull 50-50 for the third, and pure Screaming Skull for the fourth. I tried without it didn't go well and I had to strip back and base coat them all again. When you're happy, thin down Agrax Earthshade and blend out towards the tip in multiple layers to darken the ends down, and then a last touch of Nuln oil to really blacken the tips of the tusks. I built this Ghaz with the smoke plume from Mork's Raw, so I painted this in progressive shades of grey. Starting with an all-over base of Mechanicus Standard Grey, I washed it back with Nuln oil, then dry brushed back up using Mechanicus Standard Grey, Dawnstone and Administratum Grey. Nice and easy. A quick stipple of Corvus Black around the barrels and the exhaust of the engine backpack adds a bit more grime to these areas. That's about all on the painting, but I wanted to quickly highlight a small change with Makari. As said earlier, the majority of the colours are the same between the two minis, however one extra was on the hanging plate on Makari's banner. I wanted to replicate some Orc language symbols on those, so I needed to paint one green. Dead simple though, I used Caliban Green, Warpstone Glow, Moot Green and a 50-50 mix of Moot Green and Iril Yellow on that one. I picked the symbols for Gore, Wa and Mor. You know, Gork, Mork and Wa. That's all Ghaz needs to know. So since I'm tryharding my ass off on this, I figured it might be an idea to have my first go with weathering powders since the base was all painted in. Only I don't have any. I've got some cheap pastels though, which I figured would make a fine substitute when cut up. These I've had for an absolute age, but I think they were cheap things I got for a stocking stuff for Christmas present one year. I followed an old Midwinter Minis tutorial on making powders for this. Bashed up a colour I wanted, then brushed it into the base. Simple. Less is more on this, I didn't want to go too ham and ruin all this work I've done. I sealed it onto the mini with my usual light pass of Munitor and varnish when everything's done, so it didn't just rub off when handled. And with the bases sorted and the rims painted in my friend's old colour scheme, Ghazghkull and Makari are looking dead good. Perfect tribute to the boss himself, and I hope my buddy enjoys them as much as I did painting him. I spent something in the realm of 40 to 60 hours painting this guy over about 5 months, and I think all that effort shows. Even made a little display board for them afterwards, super proud of these two. If you have any questions or if I skipped over something too quickly, leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Thank you again for watching, best of luck if you're tackling Ghazghkull yourself, and I'll see you again soon.